establishing central control immediately, opening diagonals for swift development and preparing for a kingside attack. Developing a knight towards the center, preparing to challenge white's central pawn advance and control key squares. Establishing central dominance and opening diagonals for the queen and bishop. Solidifying the center and preparing for piece development, this choice opens doors for the queen's bishop. Developing the knight solidifies the pawn center and prepares for castling, a crucial step in king safety. Challenging the center directly, 3. d5 aims to break open lines and create dynamic counterplay. Preparing a fianchetto allows for long-term diagonal pressure and a solid pawn structure. Solidifying the kingside, this bishop prepares to castle, reinforcing the pawn chain and offering a safe haven. Solidifying the fianchetto, this bishop now eyes the long diagonal and adds control over central squares while preparing castling. Securing the monarch's safety now prioritizes piece development for a swift, coordinated counterstrike. Solidifying the center and preparing to contest the open files, castling brings the king to safety. Embracing the pawn sacrifice opens lines and challenges white's central control. Reclaiming that pawn now secures central influence and prepares to pressure black's queenside. Preparing to expand on the queenside, this pawn push strategically contests square control and aims to open avenues for future piece activity. Aggressively contesting the queenside space, this move prevents black from comfortably developing their queenside pieces and prepares to exploit any weakness. Developing the bishop to d7 tidies up the queenside, preparing to challenge white's central control and potentially activate the c8 bishop later. Developing the knight to b2 prepares to expand on the queenside and adds support to a potential e4 pawn push. Developing the bishop to an active square on the c6 diagonal opens up the c-file for potential future pressure. Recapturing the pawn immediately activates your knight, directly challenging black's misplaced bishop and opening lines for your own pieces. Black bravely repositions the bishop to disrupt white's queenside expansion, eyeing potential tactics on the open diagonals. Repositioning the queen to a more active diagonal now defends the pawn and prepares for central advances. Developing the knight to c6 reinforces the central pawn structure and prepares for queenside expansion. Injecting a knight onto the queenside squares creates immediate pressure and questions black's coordination. Stepping forward, the knight seizes central influence, disrupting white's queenside ambitions and preparing a dynamic counterplay. Reclaiming the queen's diagonal, white subtly pressures black's pieces while opening lines for potential attack. Boldly claiming the queenside, this knight immediately challenges white's rook and disrupts the pawn structure. Reclaiming the queen's central influence, white aims to regroup and improve piece coordination after the recent skirmishes. Initiating a central pawn rupture, black seeks to shatter white's spatial advantage and activate their pieces. Solidifying the d4 outpost and preparing to contest the central files, this knight retreat stabilizes white's pawn structure. Disrupting white's central control, this knight boldly claims a crucial outpost, challenging the queen and setting up potential tactical skirmishes. This move initiates a bold grab for central files, aiming to exploit black's slightly passive piece placement. Sacrificing pawn structure for central initiative, aiming to disrupt white's harmony. Sacrificing material for active piece play, white aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain initiative. Sacrificing the bishop for queenside activity, and an open c-file marks a bold attempt to disrupt white's harmony. Exchanges on d4 simplify, but leave black's queen awkwardly placed, potentially creating targeting opportunities. Exchanges the queen, signaling a shift towards a more positional struggle with reduced attacking potential for both sides. The knight assumes a commanding central outpost, disrupting black's harmony and posing a threat to the c6 pawn. Trading the bishop simplifies the position, but surrenders crucial dark square control and activates white's rook. Securing the king anchors your nascent endgame advantage, preparing to exploit the weakened kingside. Reasserting central influence and preparing to contest open files becomes paramount after the king's repositioning. Opening the king's file for potential activity, this pawn advance prepares to connect rooks and secure the monarch. Asserting influence over the open c-file now becomes a primary objective. Opening the central file now secures control of the d-file for white's rook, aiming for a positional advantage. The exchange on the c-file clears vital pathways, opening the rook for more active central operations. Reclaiming the open file establishes crucial central control, preparing for future pawn pushes and piece activity. Reorganizing the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to support central pawn advances. Solidifying the central pawn structure and preparing for potential pawn advances down the king's side. Opening the king's flank further promises complications, potentially exploiting the weakened pawns. Pushing the king forward signals a proactive, albeit risky, attempt to activate the monarch and potentially support a central pawn push. Initiating a pawn advance on the king side to create defensive space and potentially disrupt white's pieces. Reasserting central influence, the rook eyes the potential for queenside pressure by eyeing the open c-file, aiming to coordinate with its counterpart for future action. Seeking to reactivate the bishop and challenge the queenside pawns. Recapturing the pawn clarifies the pawn structure and aims to simplify into a more manageable endgame. This retreat strategically repositions the bishop to a more passive square, potentially hindering future attacking possibilities. Solidifying your pawn structure prevents any immediate black breakthrough and maintains king safety. Repositioning the bishop allows for better defense of the kingside pawn structure and prepares for potential activity on the c-file. Shifting the king forward aggressively aims to activate it as a fighting piece in the closing stages. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure with b6 offers some breathing room for black's pieces and prepares for potential expansion later. Advancing the queenside pawn chain aims to solidify white's space and potentially create a passed pawn later. A surprising maneuver, this knight gallops to the flank, potentially seeking respite or a surprise attack on the queenside pawn structure. A bold sortie by the knight, aiming to dominate the central squares and disrupt black's pawn structure. Repositioning the rook to contest the d-file offers greater flexibility for its future deployment. Pivoting the knight to d7 exerts significant pressure on black's queenside pawn structure and opens up avenues for further piece activity. Challenging the kingside pawns aggressively, this move injects immediate dynamism and opens avenues for the black king to become active. Relocating the king again intensifies the pawn storm pressure, exposing it to potential checks on the open files. Hoping to untangle the cramped pieces, black rallies the king for active participation. Seizing the open file and its associated squares, white forcefully initiates a pawn advance that disrupts black's compact central structure. Opening a kingside offensive is a bold response to that knight's intrusion. Activating the rook to challenge black's d-file occupation and create space for the king's safety. Unleashing the pawn storm, black aggressively targets the white king's safety on the open g-file. Centering the king offers better defense and prepares it to support the advancing pawns. Relocating the king to g8 provides a safer haven, preparing for potential pawn pushes on the kingside and a more active role. Securing the kingside pawn chain against a potential black pawn storm is the immediate priority, creating a defensive barrier. Finally, the bishop escapes its passive post, eyeing the open files and potential counterplay. The knight retreats, abandoning the attack on the pawn to prevent a catastrophic discovered check. Exploring the open files, this king maneuver aims to find a safer haven amidst the pawn storm brewing on the kingside. Activating the knight to its central outpost aims to pressure black's pawn structure and restrict their pieces. Boldly re-establishing knightly presence, this recapture opens new avenues for the black king's defense while preparing to contest the c-file. The pawn structure now solidifies, creating a passed pawn that demands black's full attention. Shifting the rook to the open file offers a pawn sacrifice to disrupt white's pawn structure and create counterplay. King's parade across the open files begins, hunting down the exposed black monarch. The rook advances to the 7th rank, aiming to penetrate the king's defenses and create mating threats. Simplifying the position by removing a knight, forcing the opponent to recapture and giving up a key central defender. Accepting the exchange simplifies the position, focusing on the king's exposed square and the pawn's advance. Reactivating the knight offers a chance to penetrate black's weakened pawn structure. Consolidating the knight into a powerful outpost on d7 will pressure black's remaining pawns and restrict his pieces. Pivoting that knight aggressively targets the isolated pawn and aims to disrupt black's defensive structure. The bishop retreats to a more active diagonal, aiming to contest the open file and perhaps prepare for a rook exchange. Reclaiming the knight's activity on the queenside is paramount for white. Preserving the bishop's long-range influence is paramount given the open diagonals. Pushing the pawn forward opens the king's path and solidifies control of the d6 square. The black king attempts to find refuge on the queenside as the passed pawn advances. Pushing the passed pawn forces a decisive confrontation for the bishop or king. The king's final escape route is blocked, surrendering the central pawn's promotion. Unleashing the knight to the central outpost seals black's fate, as the d-pawn can no longer be defended. A desperate attempt to shore up a crumbling defense and prevent the rook from entering the game decisively. Asserting central control, this knight repositions to secure the vital d4 square and survey the board's unfolding landscape. Sacrificing the bishop to clear the way for the rook's advance along the now open d-file. Capturing the bishop opens a clear path for the knight, transforming its role into an attacking force. The bishop retreats, but this position offers little solace given the compromised pawn structure and exposed king. Activating the knight to its royal outpost solidifies control over the central dark squares and prepares a decisive push toward the king side. Securing the pawn promotion threat demands immediate attention as the king is exposed. Securing the isolated pawn with the knight offers a significant material advantage. Recapturing the knight reopens lines and brings the bishop back to a more active diagonal. Unleashing the king is a bold gamble to awaken his latent power in this precarious endgame scenario. Preparing to challenge white's central pawn majority by activating the bishop to its most influential diagonal. Consolidating the king's position after the exchange sets up pressure on the queenside pawns. Black's king now becomes a target in the center of the board. Unveiling the king's sanctuary, this knight forks the monarch and a crucial pawn. A king stuck in the center becomes a prime target, especially with active enemy pieces surrounding it. Knight maneuvers towards the vulnerable king, seeking to exploit black's exposed royalty. The king is exposed, a tempting target for the knight's advance to control key squares. Unleashing the king's defender opens up a forcing sequence, aiming to exploit black's scattered pieces and promote the passed pawn. The black king now ventures into a dangerous clearing, exposing itself to the opposing knight's relentless pressure. Reclaiming central influence, the knight repositions to apply pressure and prepare for further breakthroughs. The bishop now withdraws to a more defensive outpost, maintaining its influence over the critical c7 square. The king steps back to a safer square, preparing for further action in this complex endgame. The king's safety is paramount. This aggressive check forces white's monarch into a defensive posture, potentially disrupting its coordination. Repositioning the king to its corner sanctuary offers a crucial escape route from potential tactical skirmishes.